What if everything you learned about sacred history was a carefully constructed lie? What if the faces you saw in illustrated Bibles, religious films, and churches were part of a deliberate reconstruction of a people's identity? Today, we embark on a journey that challenges centuries of tradition, a path where the truth has been buried under layers of colonial convenience, theological distortions, and complicit silence. The truth you are about to hear is not comfortable. It will not be accepted by everyone, but it has echoed in the hearts of those who, even in the silence of history, felt that something was profoundly wrong. This is the moment the veil falls. This is the moment the true descendants of the Israelites rise, not in rebellion, but for justice, memory, and faith. Prepare yourself. The revelation begins now. The first secret that must be exposed is the most visible, the physical appearance of the biblical Israelites. Why does this matter? Because the Bible describes a people whose characteristics were erased from visual records and reimagined according to European aesthetics. When we open the book of Song of Solomon 1:5, the Shulamite woman clearly states, "I am black and beautiful, O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar." This is not a poetic metaphor for emotions. It is a literal description of a dark-skinned people with an identity tied to the sun and the African land. But this was ignored, and it's not just her. In Exodus 2:19, when Moses flees Egypt and helps Jethro's daughters, they describe him as an Egyptian. Why? Because his appearance was similar to that of the Egyptians of the time, who, according to archaeological records and authentic mural art, were dark-skinned, with strong features and kinky hair. This is not a theory. It is an observation of real artifacts from real tombs. The Bible shows us Moses, Joseph, and other patriarchs being mistaken for Egyptians. And the ancient Egyptians were Africans. It's that simple. But why was this image replaced with white figures, with light eyes and European features? The answer lies in historical manipulation. During the colonial era, the European Church needed to justify slavery, racism, and dominion over African peoples. They could not admit that the descendants of Israel, the people of the promise, the people of the covenant, were among the same peoples they were kidnapping, enslaving, and humiliating. So, the images were changed. Jesus became European, the prophets became European, and over time, the lie became tradition. The second secret involves the curse of Deuteronomy 28, a key chapter that prophesies what would happen to the Israelites if they turned away from God. It describes with chilling precision a diaspora, brutal slavery, a people taken to distant nations in ships, sold as slaves to masters they did not know, with no chance of redemption. Verse 68 declares, "The Lord will bring you back to Egypt in ships." The word Egypt here is a symbol of slavery. And where in history do we see an African people being taken in ships, en masse, to serve as slaves? In the transatlantic slave trade. The west coast of Africa was devastated by centuries of human capture. Millions were torn from their families, languages, and cultures. And among those millions were peoples who maintained traditions identical to those of the Hebrews: circumcision on the 8th day, dietary laws, weekly rest, biblical names, and purification rites. They did not learn these from Christian missionaries. These practices predated any Western influence. Who were they? What do their traditions reveal? The third secret lies in linguistics. Few people know, but ancient Hebrew belongs to the Afro-Asiatic language family, a group that also includes Amharic, Tigrinya, and various languages of North and West Africa. The Yoruba people, for example, have words and concepts that align with Hebrew spirituality. Their word for God, Olodumare, echoes the concept of a single, supreme, inaccessible, and omnipresent God, like the biblical Yahweh. They observe the Sabbath, practice circumcision, have priests, sacrifices, and sacred arks. None of this was taught by colonizers. It comes from an ancestral heritage, rooted before Christianity reached Africa. The fourth shocking truth involves Moses' marriage to an Ethiopian woman. Numbers 12.1 states that Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses for marrying a Cushite woman, that is, from the region of Cush, now part of Sudan and Ethiopia. God's response to Miriam's criticism was severe. She was struck with leprosy. This shows that God not only approved of the union but condemned racial prejudice. The Bible does not ignore physical appearance. It affirms and defends it. But the rewriting of history was relentless. During the ecclesiastical councils that defined the biblical canon, texts that reinforced the African connection of the patriarchs were systematically excluded. The Book of Enoch, for example, preserved only by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church for centuries, describes celestial visions, lineages, and even physical characteristics of characters that contradict Western versions. Another erased text is the Book of Jubilees, which provides detailed genealogies and geographical locations that place biblical events much closer to the Horn of Africa than to European regions. Archaeology also comes into play. Stelae with Paleo-Hebrew writing have been found in Nigeria, Mali, and even Zimbabwe. But when discoveries like these emerge, they are quickly dismissed as coincidence, misinterpretation, or simply ignored. Why? Because accepting this evidence would mean rewriting the entire historical map of Judeo-Christian faith, and many are not ready for that. The Lemba people in South Africa and Zimbabwe have living Hebrew traditions. They keep the Sabbath, avoid pork, circumcise boys on the 8th day, and have a hereditary priesthood. DNA tests have confirmed the Y chromosome of Lemba priests contains the Cohen modal haplotype, the same found among Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews. This is not belief. It is science confirming tradition. Meanwhile, the Beta Israel people of Ethiopia maintained Jewish practices for millennia, isolated from the world. When they were recognized as Jews by modern Israel in the 1980s, there was silence in the Western Christian media. The question left hanging: if Ethiopian Jews have always been Israelites, why have biblical images always been white? Now, we return to a simple but revolutionary question. What if those sold as slaves to the Americas were, in fact, descendants of Israel? What if the African-American spiritual hymns, singing of the Exodus, Moses, and the Jordan River, are not just metaphors learned in catechism, but ancestral memories encoded in music? What if the suffering, dispersion, and spiritual resistance are the modern echo of the ancient covenant made at Sinai? This is the foundation of the first secret. The biblical Israelites were African peoples. Their appearance, culture, and identity were erased to maintain power structures. But now, the time of revelation has come. The chains that bound the bodies of millions also tried to bind their memories. Slavery was not just a physical tragedy, but an identity theft. For centuries, African peoples forced into the Americas carried fragmented memories, not just of their lands, but of rights, laws, and stories that seemed to echo the scriptures. They sang of liberation before they could even read the Bible. They shouted Moses' name in the cotton fields, cried for an exodus in the holds of ships, not as strangers to that history, but as its descendants. These songs were not just hope. They were prophecy, a forgotten prophecy, but not erased. The book of Jeremiah, in chapter 16, verses 14 and 15, declares that a time would come when people would no longer say, "The Lord lives, who brought the children of Israel up from the land of Egypt," but rather, "The Lord lives, who brought the children of Israel up from the land of the north and from all the lands where he had driven them." This promise points to a new liberation, not from physical Egypt, but from forced diaspora, from modern slavery. This is the fifth secret. Biblical history did not end in Jerusalem. It continued, silenced in the plantations of the Caribbean, in the quilombos of Brazil, in the clandestine churches of segregated America. Every generation that resisted oppression with faith, every family that preserved a tradition in secret, kept the flame of Israel alive. They did not know they were Israelites because no one wanted them to know, but their customs, their songs, their dreams revealed it. The sixth secret is genetic. Recent studies have confirmed what for centuries was treated as myth. the genetic link between various African peoples and ancient Israelites. A study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics in 2010 examined the DNA of the Lemba people and revealed the presence of the Cohen haplotype, a genetic signature associated with the Israelite priestly lineage. Another study in 2012, conducted by the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, identified genetic traits shared between Ethiopian Jews and Middle Eastern populations dating back over 3,000 years. But the similarities do not stop at DNA. They are in the practices. The Igbo people in Nigeria maintain traditions that directly echo Hebrew customs, purity rituals, circumcision on the 8th day, dietary laws, and even celebrations like Yom Kippur, which they call the Day of Atonement. They maintain Arks of the Covenant, blow trumpets similar to the shofar, and keep the Sabbath. For decades, these customs were considered tribal eccentricities, but the truth is emerging. They are traces preserved from a heritage older than any Western empire. The seventh secret lies in the maps. Medieval Arab geographers, such as Al-Idrisi, recorded the presence of organized Jewish kingdoms in West Africa, particularly in areas that today encompass Mali, Senegal, Nigeria, and Ghana. These kingdoms were not formed by converts, but by communities that traced their origins to the lost tribes of Israel. Their religious practices, social organization, rites, and even architecture revealed a deep connection to biblical Judaism. Portuguese and Spanish explorers of the 15th and 16th centuries recorded encountering black people who claimed to be descendants of Israel. They were not making this up to impress Europeans. They were recalling an ancestral truth. In their accounts, these explorers described synagogues, books of laws, ceremonial garments, and a people who prayed facing Jerusalem. What happened to these peoples? They were the first to be captured, labeled as pagans, and sold as slaves. The erasure was systematic. The eighth secret concerns works of art and visual records. Before the European Renaissance, depictions of biblical figures in Eastern icons, Ethiopian frescoes, and Egyptian manuscripts showed characters with dark skin, broad noses, and kinky hair. Jesus, Mary, the apostles, all had African or Semitic appearances. But from the 16th century onward, a new iconography emerged, that of the European Christ with blue eyes and blonde hair. Why this transformation? Because art is political. By changing Christ's appearance, the colonizer reshaped the spiritual imagination, pushing black people away from their centrality in the story of salvation. And this was reflected in the churches. In the Americas during colonialism, enslaved Africans were forbidden from praying in their languages. Their songs were censored, their traditions demonized. The drum became the devil's tool. Ceremonial dances became witchcraft. Ritual clothing became superstition. Everything was labeled inferior. But at its core, what was being erased was the connection to the ancient Hebrew faith, to the worship of Israel's ancestors. This is the ninth secret. The Western religious system was used to disconnect Africans from their own Bible, but the ancient records have not completely disappeared. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest in the world, maintained a different biblical canon, containing the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and other apocryphal texts rejected by European Christianity. These books detail visions, genealogies, and social structures that directly echo traditions still alive in parts of Africa. And why were they excluded? Because they contradicted the Europeanized version of sacred history. The Book of Enoch, for example, describes angels who descended to earth, married human women, and produced giants, something many African traditions also narrate in their mythologies. The intersection between the sacred and the ancestral is far denser than European councils were willing to admit. We now reach a crucial point. Why was all this hidden? Why were so many pieces of evidence ignored, destroyed, or marginalized? The answer is clear: power. Recognizing that the descendants of the Israelites were Africans would mean acknowledging that colonizers enslaved the children of the covenant. This would dismantle the theological justification for racism. It would collapse the doctrine of the curse of Ham, used to justify centuries of oppression. And most importantly, it would give Black people a direct connection to the divine plan, a connection that does not depend on missionaries or colonial churches, but on blood, faith, and ancestral promise. But now, the dry bones are coming back to life. The valley described by Ezekiel is rising. The muffled voices are echoing in the streets, in churches, in documentaries, in academic research. The world is beginning to hear what was once whispered in spiritual gatherings, quilombos and deserts, that the true Israelites were Black, that sacred history was distorted, that the truth is not in Renaissance paintings, but in the preserved ashes of African traditions. The scriptures say, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." This freedom is not just spiritual, it is liberation from historical lies. It is reconnection with stolen identity. With every new study, every archaeological discovery, every preserved tradition that resurfaces, a new page of the true Bible is being rewritten, not with ink, but with justice.